This is part 2 in our series on ecosystems, and in this part of the video we're going to look at nutrient exchange through ecosystems. While we said in the first video that energy flows and doesn't cycle, when we look at nutrients we can see that nutrients do cycle, and it actually employs the first one of our laws of matter. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, it just changes forms, gets moved through the system. So as energy is flowing through, we see the sunlight flowing through, the nutrients will cycle through. You can see the nutrients in blue here. So let's take a look at what we mean by that. We'll start with the carbon cycle. It should be pretty easy for us. We know that through cellular respiration, a byproduct is carbon dioxide. Also through the burning of fossil fuels, we produce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But we know that plants have a healthy appetite for carbon dioxide as they use it to incorporate the carbon during photosynthesis. They incorporate the carbon dioxide and of course release oxygen as a waste product. So if we look at how carbon cycles, carbon from the atmosphere gets taken in by plants. It's not the pen I wanted, hold on. Carbon in the form of carbon dioxide gets taken in by plants, and then those plants get eaten by primary consumers, so the carbon goes into those animals in organic matter, and then that animal might get eaten by another animal and the carbon transfers into that animal. And as these animals respire, they give off carbon dioxide, putting the carbon dioxide back into the air. Now also the plants will respire too. Plants do photosynthesis, but they're also, all their cells are respiring, so they're giving off carbon dioxide. And when these animals die and they decompose, the carbon goes into the soil, and as the microbes break those carbon sources down, they release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So it's very simple that the burning of fossil fuels and cellular respiration both produce carbon dioxide. The plants pull in the carbon dioxide, putting those carbon molecules into chemical bonds, organic matter, that gets consumed through the ecosystem. A couple of terms that we'll need throughout this part. Any reservoir is something that's holding on, in this case holding on to carbon. So the atmospheric carbon dioxide, the fossil fuels, and the organic matter are all tying up carbon dioxide. Then we can assimilate carbon dioxide or carbon through photosynthesis, and then animals consuming the plants and animals consuming other animals, they assimilate that carbon dioxide. And then the carbon is released back through respiration, decomposition, and combustion. So reservoirs, assimilation, and release. Alright, the nitrogen cycle. And this one's the messy one. This is one that takes a little bit of work. And I know that this screen's awful because it's got lots of words on it. Well, let's immediately go back to the picture, and then we'll come back and forth between this diagram and these notes that you have in your note packet. Now, there's no shortage of nitrogen. There's plenty of nitrogen. In fact, the atmosphere is 80% nitrogen. But that nitrogen is not in a usable form for most organisms. Plants do not have the ability to pull nitrogen out of the air, and neither do animals. The organisms that do have the ability to pull nitrogen out of the air are bacteria. They have the ability to fix nitrogen. To fix nitrogen means to pull it from an atmospheric form into some other organic form, or some other form, I should say, that we can use. So, if we go to our diagram, atmospheric nitrogen is pulled out of the atmosphere and into usable forms by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Okay, so the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which are found in the soil, sometimes also found in mutualistic relationships in the nodules of roots. These are actually infections on the roots, but it's a mutualistic relationship where the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are converting nitrogen into a usable form for the plant, and it's not what I meant to do there either, and pulling that nitrogen there. And also the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil is converting into nitrogen into ammonium ions. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert into ammonium. And then nitrifying bacteria convert the ammonium ions into nitrites. And nitrifying bacteria convert nitrites into nitrates. Nitrates can be assimilated by plants. So the nitrogen flows in this direction. Let me grab an arrow here. From the atmosphere through the soil to ammonium, nitrification process where we go from nitrates to nitrites, nitrites to nitrates, and the nitrates can send that nitrogen into plants. from the plants. That nitrogen can get into animals through feeding or into fungus and bacteria through decomposition. So there's the movement of nitrogen. And we also have a way to get nitrogen back into the atmosphere. There are denitrifying bacteria which convert nitrates back into N2 gas. And so it is both bacteria that bring nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it back into the atmosphere. You can see that the only way that animals or fungus or bacteria can get nitrogen is through, or for animals, the only way they can get it is by eating plants, and plants can only take in nitrates, which are produced by these bacteria that are in the soil. So let's look at the notes. Nitrification process is the process by which ammonia is converted to nitrite, and then nitrites into nitrates. Then plants can pick up the nitrates and use that to make all the nitrogen compounds that it needs, amino acids and proteins. Denitrification is the return of nitrogen to the atmosphere. And the ammonification is when during the decomposition. Let's see, ammonification is here. The decomposition, we produce the ammonium ions back into the soil through decomposition. I hope that the thing you can see so important here is the function and the role of bacteria in the nitrogen cycle. I think the key thing for you guys to do in terms of studying is to just spend time with this diagram. Make sure you know which types of bacteria do which. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria making the ammonium, nitrifying bacteria doing both processes of making nitrites and then nitrates, and the denitrifying bacteria putting it back into the atmosphere. Also remembering this relationship that some plants have with the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots. Let's move on. We'll talk about the phosphorus cycle and the water cycle next. The phosphorus cycle is pretty easy. We don't have any phosphorus in the atmosphere. Phosphorus isn't gaseous. We find phosphorus in the soil. We find phosphorus in rocks. And the cycle is that, and we can add phosphate by fertilizer, but we have inorganic phosphates available, the mineralization of phosphates in the soil, and then plants can take in phosphate through their roots, and then animals can get the phosphates from the plants. The crop residue and manure return the phosphates to the soil. Phosphates also can run off into the water and dissolve in the water, so it's not a very complicated cycle here, but we're taken out of the soil by plants, put into animals by eating the plants, and both the crop residue and the manure from the animals return phosphates to the soil. When you're talking about phosphate as a limiting factor, phosphates and nitrates are both big components of fertilizers. In an agricultural setting, it's the phosphates that we need to add to the soil and replenish it, because if you're removing these crops through harvesting, then those minerals don't get back to the soil, so you have to replenish them through fertilizer. Same thing with nitrogen. If we are harvesting crops, we need to put nitrates back into the soil, or nitrites and nitrates back into the soil, and ammonium through fertilization, or fertilizing, not fertilization, but fertilizing. And finally, the water cycle, which you probably learned a very long time ago in middle school or something. It's very simple. We have evaporation bringing the water into the atmosphere, and then precipitation bringing it down. Water also, we know, flows through plants through the process of transpiration. It's pulled out of the soil through the plants and then put into the atmosphere as it transpires through the plant. We know that during respiration we are going to produce water, and during photosynthesis we're going to use water, so we can look at water cycling through those two processes too. But this is the water cycle. It's something you all know already, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. We can look at the notes there, and you have in front of you, and see those pretty easily. So, not a lot there, nothing too difficult, stuff you should already know. In the last part of our unit in the note packet, and I'm not going to spend much time here, but there is a talk about the human impact on the environment. It's not too much of a big topic for our course, but we do need to know that as we talk about human population growth, there's an impact on the food supply and the transfer of disease through the system. We do have to account for the fact that human waste and use of water is creating a problem for water availability across the planet. In fact, there's a discussion in our notes about ozone depletion. I'll mention something briefly about that. We already talked about biological magnification. The greenhouse effect, or the idea that the increased combustion of fossil fuels is releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which causes more heat to be trapped in the Earth's surface, which is suggested to be raising the Earth's temperature, and the greenhouse effect and global warming. Briefly, we can talk about ozone depletion. Ozone is O3 molecule, which is a unique structure. It's three oxygen molecules attached to each other, kind of this triangle. We know that each oxygen likes to make two bonds, so this shape does work, but it's not a very stable molecule. Once it's broken, once you break this bond and produce oxygen gas, and it doesn't reform under many conditions. It's pretty extreme conditions under which ozone will form. So once we destroy it, it doesn't reform very well. The ozone layer is important to the atmosphere because it blocks a lot of the UV radiation. That's why it's an issue. And this shows how these chlorofluorocarbons will break those bonds and actually reduce the amount of ozone that we have in the atmosphere. This picture is showing the effect of the greenhouse gases trapping the heat in as it reflects back off the planet. And what else? Acid rain. We'll talk a little bit about that in class, and the creation or the speeding up of the rate of desertification, the creation of deserts as we overgraze grasslands, and the effect of deforestation and pollution. We'll talk about all this in class. I'm going to just leave all that for class. Alright, and so I have some cool pictures of the effects of acid rain, and that brings us to an end.